Hi, I'm Miss Wellman, and today I am going to introduce to you our novel for this unit. We are going to be reading the book Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. That's the full title, and it's written by Mary Shelley, who is the lovely lady that is in the portrait next to me. In the portrait next to her, with the man holding up the torch, that is Prometheus. And we're going to talk a little bit about him in this lesson as well, because he does play a key role in this book, or in the inspiration of this book. So today we are going to give a little bit of background on Mary Shelley. We're going to talk about the summer of 1816, which technically starts in the spring of 1815, but it'll make sense later. We're going to dip our toes a little bit into science with that. And then we're going to give a quick Greek myth refresher, talking about Prometheus, who he was, his background, and what his myth kind of means. And then we're going to briefly touch on the themes in Frankenstein. We won't go super in depth on them just because you haven't started reading the novel yet. And so we want to make sure that we give you guys plenty of time to read the novel, kind of see the themes playing out before we go more in depth on them. And that'll happen in a later lesson. So to get started, who was Mary Shelley? The link below the title, A Brief Dive into Mary's Life, that will take you to a really good YouTube video that is about 11 minutes long, and it very concisely tells the story of Mary, who she was, what she did, her family background, things like that. So really just important facts that we don't have time to fully watch the video during this lesson. But in your lesson intro notes where you found this, obviously, I have the slides to this presentation linked for you guys to have as notes to use throughout the unit. And so you're more than welcome to, on your own time, if you're curious, watch that video. It does give you really good information that could benefit you just knowing about throughout this unit. So just so that's something available to you. But we're going to move a little further and talk about who Mary Shelley was. So she was born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. She was born to parents Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Mary, her mother, was a prominent author and a feminist writer. So she wrote things other than feminist literature, but she did was really known for her feminist writing. She's kind of termed as the first feminist, which there were many women who had the same ideals as her before her in multiple places and cultures. But she was one of the first women to kind of put her thoughts on paper. And she wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792 that became a cornerstone of not only feminist literature, but a cornerstone of the, a cornerstone of feminist literature, but then also a stepping stone that would be used to write the rights of women, which would eventually help get women to get the right to vote. Again, a century or so on down the line, but still, she was, I guess, more than a century or so. But a very prolific writer, very intelligent woman who, again, just really tried to use the gift she had of writing and tried to give as many women a voice as possible, because in this age, it was before the Victorian era, not too much though, but before the Victorian era, and women didn't have any rights. They were either properties of their husbands or properties of their fathers. And they couldn't own land, couldn't really have their own money, things like that. Women just didn't have a lot. And Mary and other women didn't think that was right. And so they tried to use their voice to make change. And eventually that did happen. And Mary Wollstonecraft was definitely one of the people who, started the ripple effect. So that was her mother, Mary Shelley's mother. And Mary's father was William Godwin. And so William Godwin was an early philosopher and a very prominent proponent of anarchism. Basically, he really didn't think that people should be considered property. He didn't think that there really should be like this like hierarchy of like lords and ladies and kings and whatever else. Like he just didn't think that was okay, and he thought there was a better government out there than what he was living with in England, and really just wanted more equality. Essentially, it was like a very very um, slight overview of William Godwin and what he believed in. He was also a writer. I do believe he wrote mostly like pamphlets and more informational things. He might have had some poetry, but I can't remember off the top of my head if he did or not. But mostly he was a writer about like social issues. And because of her parents being writers, being thinkers, being kind of the square pegs and round holes, um, Mary grew up around a lot of different folks. And a lot of writers. Specifically, she grew up with a poet named Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, both very prolific romantic poets. Um, Romantic with capital R, not like a flower and love and like whatever kind of romantic, but romantic as in the Romanticism era, Romanticism poetry, which we'll get into in a little bit. But she grew up with a lot of free thinkers, people who, again, were square pegs and round holes, just did not fit in, which kind of would describe Mary throughout her life. Um, We're gonna just go back for a second too, because I forgot to talk about this. But a big part of Mary's character too is the fact that she grew up without a mother. Her mother died shortly after Mary was born, um, and she died of sepsis because at the time, healthcare is not the same as it is today. And what happened was Mary Wollstonecraft, gave birth to Mary Godwin, so MG we'll call her. So MW had MG, and then she was still experiencing some issues. Doctor was still there. Doctor went to go help take care of the issue. He didn't wash his hands. And because of not washing his hands when he was helping MW, he ended up passing an infection to her, which caused sepsis, which caused her to die within like hours. So, unfortunately, Mary Wollstonecraft died and was not able to be a part of her daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin's life, which does kind of play a key role in Mary. And we'll see that as we kind of keep moving forward. But that's really important things. I had to circle back to it. I promise I will do better at going through this as we keep going through the lesson. So, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin before, fell in love with Percy Shelley when she was 16. He was 21. I think they met at like her father's shop. Kind of like love at first sight type of thing. He was a poet at the time, but he wasn't really recognized as a poet. Like he did writing and stuff, but he wasn't like well known for it. But he would later become a very prominent figure in romantic poetry, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But they fell in love, like again, almost instantly, and they decided to run away together. And as they ran away together, Mary became pregnant, but unfortunately, she lost a child like very, very early on. And that would unfortunately be something that happened to Mary quite frequently. She would be pregnant a total of 4 times, and only that fourth pregnancy ended with a child who lived to adulthood. His name was Percy Florence Shelley, who, just from like research that I've seen and stuff, he really became the apple of Mary's eye. Because with him, she finally got to be a mother. That was something that she'd always wanted. She never grew up with a mother, but always really wanted to be one. And again, it took several tries, but eventually she had Percy, and she was able to be the mother that she always wanted to be. So there is a lot of tragedy, like that is still like one very happy thing that had happened to her. However, it was shortly after Percy was born that Percy, the father, ended up passing away, which we'll get to in a little bit as well. But Mary's legacy is that she is now kind of known as the mother of science fiction. Um, she was, we'll talk about later, she was more of a Gothic writer, and she wrote, more so in the Gothic horror section of Gothic literature. However, nowadays, knowing what we know about the book and what all happens, how it all happens, she fits kind of more into that science fiction realm, which we'll talk about a little bit later in other lessons and stuff. But she is the mother of science fiction. She kind of like invented a whole genre, which is crazy. And she invented it like at 16 too, which we'll touch on later. But it's just wild. She's the mother of science fiction. She like created the genre. Um, and after her husband died, she really had to like change her focus. So she focused on, first of all, trying to spend more time with her son, taking care of him, being a mother to him, being present. And then when she wasn't like in mom mode, she was trying to work on publishing her husband Percy's previously unpublished poetry. And she is a very large part of the reason why he is as prolific as a poet as he is today. She went through and found poems that he had not published. She put them in books, like in volumes, things like that, and she really worked hard on publishing all of his work that hadn't gotten out before he had passed away. And that was a really just important thing to her, that her husband had his poetry that he hadn't been able to publish in his time published. And again, she is a big part of the reason as to why he is seen as an important romantic author in our time. Um, on top of that, on top of being a mother, on top of trying to publish her husband's poetry, so that his legacy would live on, she also wrote and published a total of 6 other books after Frankenstein, novels after Frankenstein. And they were sorry, my cat's trying to help me. Valperga, The Life and Adventures of Castoruso, Prince of Lucca, in 1823, which I believe that was like a historical fiction type book. She wrote The Last Man in 1826. Which was probably her other like most well-known book aside from Frankenstein. The Last Man is actually an early example of like a post-apocalyptic future. And then she also wrote The Fortunes of Perkin Warbeck, which again is also, I believe, a historical fiction type one. And then she wrote Lador in 1835, Faulkner in 1837, and then finally her last book to be published was in the 50s, actually. And it was written shortly after she had finished up Frankenstein, but it's one that she had never published herself. That was Mathilda. She had written that around 1819, but it was not published until 1959. So she kind of ran the gamut of not only like novel genres, but also years of publishing and stuff. So she leaves a legacy of not only, again, publishing all of her husband's previously unpublished poetry, but a legacy of writing 6 novels after her biggest hit, Frankenstein. Oh my goodness, that's my daughter. I'm going to pause quick so I can go close the door. All right. So, our next segment of this lesson today is we are going to talk about the summer of 1816. So again, the link below we're not going to watch. I would, just because it talks much more in depth than I can, and like way more knowledge than I have, about this event. But essentially, a volcano erupting in Indonesia resulted in Mary Shelley winning a scary story contest. Which, if that isn't the most crazy domino effect out there, I don't know what is, but it's just very, very interesting, and we're going to talk about it. So, there is a time called the Year Without a Summer, and it's the summer of 1816, but everything starts a year before that. So, on April 5th in 1815, Mount Tambora, which is a volcano in Indonesia, erupts. that's what's kind of pictured here. It's an artistic rendition of what it looked like at the time. And so this eruption completely destroyed the village of Tambora, kind of similar to like Pompeii, but just not really as well known, because it wasn't really like in Western culture, so it wasn't as much reported on really. But anyway, so village of Tambora wiped off the map. And then that eruption from the volcano started off a series of chain reaction climate events. So the volcano erupts, and then it releases like a really, really, really big ash cloud into the atmosphere. And that atmosphere kind of like, it changes everything. So with the big ash cloud, it kind of blocks out the sun. And because of that, a lot of different things are happening, like kind of like a domino effect. So there's a massive ash cloud, blocks out the sun. The world climate, like all around the world, drops 3 degrees, which doesn't seem huge, but it really affected a lot of things that we'll see. There's an outbreak of cholera because as weather changes, it gets colder, sicknesses come. Cholera was already a thing at the point, but with more sickness or more cold, that gave the bacteria kind of room to like thrive, and that caused a bad outbreak of cholera. And then the crop harvest worldwide is bleak and famine begins in certain areas. A couple of things that I talked about in the video that I didn't cover here, but like, I believe it was in Japan or China. I think it was China. With how bad the weather was, they couldn't really grow rice anymore. So instead of growing rice in some fields, they grew poppies. And poppies are a plant that people could make opium from. At the time, opium was supposed to be like a medicine. And it did have medicinal purposes, but it also is a drug and can be used for not medicinal purposes. And because of this event at this time, later in 18, like around like 18, more like 17, I guess, and further, there was a really big opium trade that started. So just because of this volcano erupting, that also happened in that part of the world too, which is another insane thing. But things are not looking good for people in the year 1815, 1816. So all over the world is kind of being affected. However, it didn't really hit where our story starts until the next year. And that's because if you look at a map, Indonesia and where Mount Tamara is, it's like right down where that black circle is in Indonesia. And then the ash cloud went up across the atmosphere, right? And then it kind of traveled around the world. So like it went through Malaysia, China got a hit, Japan got a hit, like all this area got a hit, like closer to the end of 1815. And then in 1816 is when it kind of started heading out more west. And that's where our story starts, was in, or not our story, but like our I guess story today, with the summer of 1816. Just want to add some visual context that I took a little bit to get to Europe, which is where it affects Mary Shelley. So this is a very cultural domino effect that we're getting into a little bit. And we're going to pause on Mary's story for a second, just because this is also kind of important to note that this is the world that she was growing up in right now. So people kind of fell into two camps in reacting to this change in weather. Because again, it's colder. The summer is like, there's hardly any sun. You're wearing like a sweater in July. Things are not normal. And so people either like tried to adapt and tried to like plant crops that would grow in minimal sun, tried to find innovative ways to feed people, things like that. Or they thought the world was ending. The world was, coming to an end, because again, they didn't have the science that we have now. And so they didn't have any way to explain anything. And so they could only explain the way they could of, we're going to buckle down and just try to ride this out, or we're going to worry about it, which are both, at the time, I think that's very valid feelings to have about like really just chaotic times. And so these two schools of thought really influenced Romanticism and Gothic literature, which we're going to briefly touch on right here. We'll touch more on Romanticism as its own lesson and also Gothic literature as its own lesson. But just to kind of give a brief idea about both of those things, Romanticism really believes in emotion, imagination, and individualism are way more important than reason and order. And they really valued nature and the past. Whereas in Gothic literature, had similar ideas, but they wanted to make it spooky. So they like dark and mysterious settings, an atmosphere that is suspenseful, has some terror, throw in some supernatural elements, and some like human psyche in there to kind of explore fear, things like that. And that was what the Gothics really hooked onto, in terms of just their look at literature, art, things like that. And we'll touch on that again in a different lesson. But all this is happening. These are the times that Mary is growing up in. And then we have the summer of 1816 at Villa Dioti. That's how you say it. Anyway, so it's June 1816, and poet Lord Byron, Mary and Percy Shelley, and Clara, who is Mary's sister, rent a house together near Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And so it's kind of pictured here. Gorgeous house, gorgeous setting. The weather, terrible. It was unseasonably cold and it was rainy, and they couldn't go out and do any of the fun things that they would normally do when they're at this villa by the lake. Kind of like when we go to lake in the summer in Minnesota. So, without any ability to go do anything fun, they all took to reading, and they took turns reading specifically from a book called Phantasmagoriana, which is a French anthology of German ghost stories. So telling ghost stories, it's kind of like spooky outside. So they made it spooky inside by telling all these like ghost stories that were from Germany, which German ghost stories do go pretty hard. So they're really getting into it. And because of these ghost stories, Lord Byron issued a challenge. So he was inspired by the reading, and he challenged everybody to write the best ghost story or the best scary story that they could. So everyone went off to their own corners that night and tried to write their own ghost story. But that night, Mary had a horrible nightmare, and she talks about it in some letters. In her dream, she saw a man bent over a horrifying creature, the hideous phantasma of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. That was her dream. And then this dream inspired her to write what we now know as Frankenstein. So Mary, she's, again, I don't think I told us yet, but she is 16 years old at the time of this. Maybe 17. Kind of depends on where you read it. But teenager, 16 years, 17 years old, somewhere in there. And she takes paper, takes pen, writes down Frankenstein, tells it to her captive audience. Everyone was terrified of a teenage girl. And again, it's only like 2 men and a woman, but like the men had the lights on later, from again, like tales that are told at night. They're not doing too hot at all. And so Mary won the ghost story competition. And Frankenstein was, again, the winner of this sad, scary story. So after that, she put pen to paper, wrote Frankenstein, got it published, all of that. The whole title that we talked about earlier of Frankenstein is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. This video down here, again, is a video that tells you about Prometheus, his whole myth. I'm going to cover the basics of it. So the basics of Prometheus are that he and his brother Epimetheus were Titans who fought with the Greek gods against their fellow Titans during the uprising. And for their help, the two brothers were charged with the responsibility to create life on Earth. Prometheus specifically was given the job of making humans. He molded humans from mud and then gave them life. Zeus thought he did great, was very proud. However, he didn't want these humans to be immortal. So they had to be mortal. They had to die eventually. Prometheus did not love that. And so he tried his very, very best to give humanity a fighting chance. In one way, he tricked Zeus into picking a lesser sacrifice offering so that way humans could eat meat. And then Zeus retaliated with that by withholding fire so they couldn't cook the meat to actually eat the meat. So Prometheus, he stole fire from the workshop of Hephaestus and Athena and then gave it to humanity so they could like cook meat, eat it, and live longer, better lives. And for that, he was published for his crimes against the gods. And with that, he was, I'm sure you've heard the myth, but he's chained to a rock. An eagle comes every single day to eat his liver, and that's his life forever on a cycle. But never once did he ever at least show any regret for doing what he had to for people. And there are two camps of thought of what this myth means. And we kind of see that in both of how the Shelleys interacted with the myth. So Percy saw the myth and he thought that Prometheus was a romantic hero who would go on to spread empathy and knowledge. So like he thought Prometheus was a great guy, did the right things, and should really if he were real, he would like keep doing it around the world. Whereas Mary thought that Prometheus was a cautionary tale about what happens when you subvert the world's natural order. So she didn't necessarily think that what Prometheus did was wrong, but his cautionary tale of like, when you go against what's supposed to happen, here's what happens to you. And so again, it's like there's consequences for your actions, kind of what she thought about that myth, which kind of goes into a couple of our themes that we'll see presented in this novel. So again, a brief overview of our themes that we'll cover in this are the theme of creation, the pursuit of knowledge, scientific advancement versus ethics, parental responsibility, consequences of abandonment, appearance versus reality, the impact of societal perceptions, isolation and loneliness, revenge, and there's a whole lot more. But those are just kind of the main ones that we'll touch on. I'm running out of time in this recording, so I'm going to have to wrap it up right now. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching this with me. And remember that aside from going through this, you have a reading to do as well. The reading for today is, I believe, just letters 1 through 4. Oh, I'm sorry. This is for tomorrow. So scratch that. No reading for today. There is a quick check at the end of this lesson that goes over what we covered today. But that is all I have for you. We'll see you again tomorrow with a little bit of reading and a little bit of more background. That's all I have. Have a great day, and I hope that you enjoy reading Frankenstein.